Welcome back. Today I want to take you back 500 years, to a time before the world as we know it existed, and trace the chain of events that led to one of the most pivotal moments in history, the discovery of America. In 1492, the world changed forever. Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, set out to find a new route to Asia, but what he stumbled upon was something entirely unexpected: a vast, uncharted continent. With 3 small ships and an unshakable belief, Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed in the Caribbean, opening the door to a new age of exploration, conquest, and cultural collision. Though he believed he had reached the Indies, his voyages would ignite centuries of transformation, shaping the fate of empires and forever altering the course of history. This is the story of that discovery and the world it awakened. But before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is for you, and whether you're listening to fall asleep or just passing the time while learning a bit of history. And if you enjoy the stories I tell, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support me in making more content like this. Now, let's begin. It begins with a myth we all thought we knew, that in 1492, a brave Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain and stumbled upon a new world, forever changing the course of history. But that story, the one we were told in school books and childhood lessons, was only a fragment of the truth. Long before Columbus, the Americas were home to vast, complex civilizations. Cities of stone rose from jungle canopies, empires ruled over mountains and plains, and networks of trade and knowledge flourished without ever needing the old world. The Aztec and Maya in the south, the Mississippian cultures in the north, the Inca stretching across the spine of the Andes. These were not forgotten corners of the earth waiting to be found. They were alive, proud, and deeply rooted in their own histories. And even when it comes to European footprints, Columbus was not the first. Norse explorers, led by Leif Erikson, landed in North America around the year 1000, nearly 5 centuries earlier. Archaeological remains at El Anso Meadows in Newfoundland confirm it. Viking sails touched American shores, if only briefly, before fading into obscurity. Yet despite those truths, it was Columbus's voyage that lit the fuse of global transformation. His arrival did not go unnoticed. It echoed across oceans, through palaces and ports, and into the hearts of monarchs and merchants. Not because he found new lands, but because he connected 2 worlds that had drifted apart for over 10,000 years. And in doing so, he unleashed forces that would reshape everything. But before we get to the voyage, we need to understand what made it possible. Because Columbus didn't sail into an empty sea on a whim. He emerged from a Europe that was fractured, hungry, and restless. A continent seeking answers and riches across the horizon. The Fall of Constantinople in 1453 had cut off access to the Silk Road and the overland trade routes that once fed Europe with the spices, silks, and precious goods of Asia. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the gateways to the east, and every transaction came with a cost. That cost grew unbearable. Spices, which once flavored the tables of nobility, now became symbols of power. A pound of pepper could buy a servant. Nutmeg and cloves were hoarded like treasure. In this climate of urgency, Portugal took the lead. Sailors like Prince Henry the Navigator had already begun pushing down the coast of Africa, mapping new lands and setting up trading posts. They were looking for a sea route around Africa to the riches of the east, and they were succeeding. By 1488, Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Spain, meanwhile, had been locked in a centuries-long war. The Reconquista, a campaign to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule, finally ended in 1492 with the capture of Granada. That same year, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella found themselves with both a unified kingdom and a desire to expand their influence. They needed something bold, something that could place Spain ahead of Portugal. And to Columbus. He was not the noble explorer often painted in portraits, but a skilled navigator with unshakable ambition. Born in Genoa around 1451, Columbus had spent his youth in the seafaring world of the Mediterranean. He was self-educated, endlessly curious, and deeply religious. But above all, He was convinced the world was smaller than it really was. Columbus believed he could reach Asia by sailing west. Based on flawed maps and underestimated distances, he argued that the Earth's circumference was narrow enough to allow a direct ocean passage to the east. Many disagreed. Experts said the journey would be suicidal. But Columbus was relentless. He petitioned courts across Europe. Portugal turned him down. England passed. So did France. But in Spain, he found a court willing to gamble. After years of rejection, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella agreed to fund his voyage. It wasn't faith in science that swayed them, but the lure of empire. If Columbus was wrong, they would lose little. If he was right, Spain could become the richest power in Europe. In April 1492, the crown signed the capitulations of Santa Fe. Columbus was granted the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any lands he found. He would receive a tenth of all profits. It was an extraordinary deal for a man with no noble birth. By August, Columbus was ready to sail. He had secured 3 ships, modest by today's standards, but sturdy and crewed by men who knew the risks. The Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He left from Palos de la Frontera with about 90 men on board, most of them hoping for fortune, some fearing death, and all of them sailing toward the unknown. What lay ahead was not a shortcut to Asia, but something much stranger. A voyage into silence, over an ocean no European had dared cross without sight of land. A journey that would begin quietly enough, with calm waters and clear skies, but grow darker with each passing week. No maps guided them, no stars promised salvation. They were gambling not just with their lives, but with the weight of nations pressing behind them. In Columbus's log, he wrote of steady winds and growing doubts among the men. After a few weeks, whispers of mutiny began to spread. Some feared they would sail forever. Others questioned if they had been led by a madman. But each night, Columbus calmed them with certainty. He kept 2 logs, one true, one false. To the crew, he reported shorter distances, easing their minds. To himself, he recorded the real journey, knowing how far they had truly gone. Then came strange signs, floating vegetation, carved wood, birds flying west. Hints of land, almost mythical, whispered across the waves. And just before dawn, on October 12, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana cried out from the Pinta, "Tierra! Tierra!" Land had been sighted. Columbus later claimed he saw it first, to claim his reward. But history remembers the voice of that sailor, breaking the silence of the sea. They had reached an island in the Bahamas. Columbus named it San Salvador. He believed he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. He was wrong. But in that moment, none of them knew what they had truly done. They had not found a new path to the east. They had opened a door to something far larger, and nothing would ever be the same again. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent shockwaves through Europe, leaving centuries-old land routes to Asia closed off to Western merchants. Suddenly, the luxurious spices, silks, and precious gems of the East became treasures harder to reach, more costly, and infinitely more desirable. The once reliable caravan trails, winding through vast deserts and mountains, were now controlled by the Ottoman Empire, whose rising power reshaped trade and diplomacy. For the European kingdoms, especially Spain and Portugal, this was a crisis and an opportunity wrapped into one. Imagine the markets of Venice and Genoa, bustling with merchants and exotic goods, growing anxious as their supply chains tightened. The prices of cinnamon, pepper and cloves, the exotic spices that flavored both food and fortune, soared beyond imagination. It was not merely a quest for taste, but a fierce competition for wealth and influence. Spices were, in a sense, the gold of the late Middle Ages, and the ability to control their flow could make or break kingdoms. Portugal, with its long Atlantic coast, had already taken daring steps to explore the unknown. Prince Henry the Navigator had sponsored expeditions down the western coast of Africa, inching closer to India with each journey. These voyages, painstaking and perilous, proved that the ocean was not an insurmountable barrier, but a path waiting to be charted. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were rounding the Cape of Good Hope, edging closer to the fabled riches of the East. Their progress, however, was slow and expensive, and Spain felt the pressure to find an alternative route. Spain's urgency was not only economic, but also deeply political. The Iberian Peninsula was emerging from centuries of conflict. The Reconquista had just ended in 1492, with the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, were eager to assert Spain's place among Europe's powers. The Portuguese success in Africa, combined with the closing of land routes, created a perfect storm for exploration. Spain needed a bold plan. Into this turbulent moment stepped Christopher Columbus, a man whose dreams were as vast as the oceans themselves. He believed, with unwavering conviction, that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could reach Asia, the land of spices, silk, and unimaginable wealth, far more directly than by the southern African route. His calculations, though flawed by today's standards, convinced him the distance was manageable. In truth, he underestimated the size of the Earth and the vastness of the Atlantic by thousands of miles. For years, Columbus pitched his vision to the courts of Portugal and Spain, only to be turned away repeatedly. His persistence was remarkable. He clung to his idea with a stubbornness that bordered on obsession. Some historians suggest that Columbus knew his maps were not entirely accurate, but he was driven by the chance to achieve fame and fortune, to win the favor of monarchs, and perhaps to find a new path for Christianity to spread. When finally, in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to finance his expedition, it was a gamble that carried the hopes of a nation. The deal they struck was generous. Columbus was promised titles and a share of any riches he might find. The crown's backing gave legitimacy to his plan, but it was far from certain that the voyage would succeed. The ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, were modest vessels, not designed for such an ambitious journey. The crews, a mix of experienced sailors and adventurers, faced weeks of uncertainty on the open sea. There were moments of doubt, when the horizon seemed endless and the wind fickle. Rumors of monsters and sea serpents filled the minds of the less hardened. Some feared the ships would never return, swallowed by the vastness. Life aboard those vessels was harsh. Sailors contended with cramped quarters, limited food and fresh water, and the ever-present threat of storms. The monotony was broken only by the turning of the stars, and the occasional sighting of birds or floating debris, signs that land might be near. Discipline was strict, but tension simmered below the surface. The possibility of mutiny was real, a reminder that even the boldest dreams depended on fragile human trust. Columbus himself carried the weight of his vision quietly. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. His journal entries, written with careful detail, reveal a mind racing to make sense of the vast unknown. When finally, on the morning of October 12, 1492, the lookout aboard the Pinta shouted, "Land!" It was a moment that would echo through history. The landfall was not in Asia as Columbus had hoped, but on an island in the Bahamas. The sense of relief and wonder must have been immense, mixed with confusion and anticipation. What lay ahead was a world no European had truly seen before, full of beauty and mystery, inhabited by peoples with their own stories, cultures, and lives. Yet beneath this awe was a growing tension. Columbus's quest was not just about discovery, it was also a search for wealth and power. The Spaniards' eyes were fixed on gold, even when it proved elusive. They saw the native peoples as potential allies, guides, or obstacles, depending on how they responded to these strange new arrivals. The vastness of the ocean had been crossed, but the true journey was only beginning. What seemed like a simple voyage to new lands was a turning point in human history, a collision of worlds with consequences that no one at the time could fully understand. Reflecting on this, it is striking how much rested on hope, uncertainty, and a willingness to push beyond known boundaries. The spirit of that age, with its mix of ambition and fear, shaped the path that Columbus and his crew would follow, and the path that history would forever remember. Sometimes, when I think about those days, I wonder about the quiet moments on those ships. The sailors staring out at endless water, wondering what lay beyond. the dreams they carried, and the unknowns that awaited. It is a reminder that history is not just dates and facts, but human lives woven into the fabric of time. Lives full of hope, doubt, courage, and consequence. The world was on the brink of profound change, and the next steps would be both wondrous and tragic. Christopher Columbus is a name that evokes images of bold adventure, distant lands, and the dawning of a new era. Yet, when we look closer at the man behind the legend, the story becomes far more intricate, human, and at times, uncertain. Born around 1451 in Genoa, a bustling port city that was a hub of Mediterranean trade, Columbus grew up surrounded by sailors, merchants, and the restless hum of maritime life. His father was a wool weaver, a modest trade, but the young Columbus's ambitions stretched far beyond the family workshop. From an early age, he was fascinated by the sea and the vast, uncharted horizons it promised. The world he was born into was changing rapidly. Europe's knowledge of geography was expanding, but still riddled with gaps and misconceptions. Maps often blended fact and fantasy, and the oceans remained wild and unpredictable. Despite this, Columbus dreamed of finding a new path to the riches of Asia. The spices, silks, and precious metals that had for centuries driven trade and shaped empires. What's striking about Columbus is not just his vision, but his sheer stubbornness. His idea, radical for the time, was that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could reach Asia. A shortcut that would bypass the long, dangerous routes dominated by Muslim traders and controlled by Portuguese navigators around Africa. The problem was, many scholars and sailors thought the Earth was smaller, or that the ocean was far too vast to cross successfully. Some even feared that ships would sail off the edge of the world. Columbus's calculations were off. He underestimated the circumference of the Earth by thousands of miles. But he clung to his belief, propelled by a mixture of hope, conviction, and a sense of destiny. His persistence led him first to the Portuguese court, a powerful maritime nation already exploring the African coast. However, the Portuguese rejected his proposal. They preferred the route around Africa, which was already proving profitable. Undeterred, Columbus turned to Spain. It was 1486 when he first approached King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Spain was a kingdom on the rise, freshly united after centuries of conflict, with ambitions to expand beyond Europe. Yet, his proposal was met with skepticism. Funding such a risky and unproven expedition was a gamble few were willing to take. For 6 long years, Columbus faced rejection, court intrigues, and delays. Meanwhile, the political and economic landscape shifted. In 1453, Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks, effectively closing overland trade routes to Asia for European powers. The demand for spices and luxury goods soared, making the search for a new maritime route urgent and fiercely competitive. In 1492, after relentless lobbying, Queen Isabella finally agreed to support Columbus's voyage. The terms were generous. Columbus would be made admiral of the ocean sea and governor of any lands he discovered. It was a royal gamble on a man many still considered an outsider, a dreamer with shaky maps and even shakier math. One aspect often overlooked is Columbus's personal motivations. He was not just an explorer chasing fame. His writings reveal a man deeply influenced by religious fervor and the hope of spreading Christianity. There was also the hope of wealth, both for himself and the crown. In some letters, he speaks of converting new peoples and opening new markets. His vision was a blend of commerce, faith, and adventure, a complex mix that shaped his decisions and actions. Columbus's background was also more cosmopolitan than many realize. Though Genoese by birth, he had lived in Portugal and possibly traveled along the West African coast. His familiarity with maritime navigation was substantial, though not always precise. Some historians suggest he had access to maps and knowledge from various sources, including the legendary Ptolemaic traditions and Arab geography. Interestingly, Columbus's voyage was not just about discovery, but also about competition. The Portuguese crown, led by King John II, was eager to block Spanish advances and solidify their monopoly on African routes. This rivalry added urgency and tension to the exploration efforts in the late 15th century. Spain's decision to back Columbus was partly motivated by the desire to catch up. and perhaps leapfrog Portugal's dominance. The year 1492 was pivotal for another reason. It marked the completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. Just months before Columbus set sail, Granada fell, ending Muslim presence in Spain. The mood in the Spanish court was triumphant and expansionist, fueling ambitions for overseas conquest. Columbus was thus a man shaped by his times, a blend of medieval faith and emerging Renaissance curiosity. He carried the hopes of a kingdom eager for glory, wealth, and spiritual conquest. Yet he also bore the weight of immense uncertainties and challenges. His math was flawed, his maps imperfect, and his understanding of the Atlantic largely speculative. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he was convinced that success was within reach. It's said that he once remarked to a skeptic that the land was just beyond the horizon, waiting to be found. That stubbornness, that refusal to give up, propelled him forward when others hesitated. What I find particularly compelling is the human side of this story. A man who faced rejection time and again, but clung to his vision with almost desperate hope. Imagine the tension in those years, the nights spent poring over charts, the conversations in dimly lit chambers, trying to convince skeptical monarchs and advisors. There's a quiet drama there, a tale of ambition mixed with uncertainty and the unknown. When finally the royal support came, preparations had to be hurried, ships had to be gathered, crew recruited, provisions stored. Columbus was given 3 ships, the Minya, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. None of them were large by today's standards, more like sturdy fishing vessels than the mighty galleons that would sail decades later. The crew was a mix of seasoned sailors, adventurers, and even some who were pressed into service, not always enthusiastic about the voyage ahead. Life at sea was harsh, cramped quarters, the constant threat of storms, scurvy, and the mental strain of crossing an unknown ocean with no landmarks to guide them. It's worth pausing to consider how remarkable it was that this voyage even happened. In an age before accurate longitude measurements, with little knowledge of the Atlantic's breadth, and with a crew fearful of the unknown, Columbus managed to set sail with determination few could match. The blend of bravery, desperation, and hope is palpable when you imagine those ships slipping away from Spain's coast in August 1492, heading into what many thought was an endless void. There is something profoundly human in that leap into uncertainty, a willingness to trust in an idea, to embrace risk, and to chase a vision that might never materialize. It's easy to look back with the benefit of hindsight and see Columbus as a hero or a villain. But at this moment, he was simply a man driven by a dream, caught in the currents of history and ambition. I sometimes wonder what he must have felt as the coastline of Spain faded behind him, the familiar replaced by endless blue, the wind carrying his hopes, the silence filled with unspoken fears and prayers. What conversations passed in the dim light of the ship's quarters? What doubts were quietly pushed aside? These moments, so full of tension and quiet wonder, remind me that history is not just dates and facts, but the stories of real people with dreams, fears, and fragile hopes. The vast expanse of the Atlantic stretched before them, an uncharted wilderness of water and sky that seemed to mock the very idea of certainty. For Columbus and his crew, the days at sea were a slow unraveling of resolve, punctuated by the creak of timbers, the slap of waves, and the occasional cry of a gull far overhead. It was October 12th, 1492, when, at last, the lookout aboard the Pinta called out with a voice sharp and urgent. "Land!" The relief must have been palpable, a mixture of disbelief and hope, mingling like the salt air on their weathered skin. But the land they first sighted was not the vast continents imagined, nor the wealthy empires of gold and silk Columbus had promised to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Instead, it was a cluster of small islands, verdant and alive with unfamiliar sounds. The place we now call the Bahamas welcomed them, though its tranquility would soon be overshadowed by the ambitions and misunderstandings that followed. Their first encounters with the Tyino people unfolded with a fragile grace. The indigenous inhabitants appeared curious and cautious, approaching with gifts of food and weaving, their eyes wide with wonder and gentle kindness. Columbus, ever the dreamer, noted in his journals the beauty of their land and the innocence of its people, whom he described as generous and without weapons. He saw in them potential subjects for the Spanish crown and guides to the riches he sought, but perhaps did not fully grasp the complexity of their societies or the depth of their cultures. There is something quietly haunting in the way first meetings like these are remembered, moments suspended between discovery and loss. The Tyino welcomed strangers with open hands, unaware that this greeting would mark the beginning of profound upheaval. The Europeans, driven by a hunger for gold and empire, began to map out the islands not as home to others, but as territories to claim. Columbus's exploration continued with visits to other islands, such as Cuba and Hispaniola. The latter would become the site of the first European settlement in the New World, named La Navidad. Built from the remains of Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, which had run aground on Christmas Day in 1592. The fragile outpost stood as a symbol of hope, but also a seed of conflict, planted on foreign soil without full understanding or respect for those who already lived there. As the months wore on, the initial wonder gave way to tension and hardship. The search for gold became an obsession, blinding many to the realities around them. Columbus and his men took hostages from the indigenous population, hoping to coerce cooperation and extract information about the precious metals they so desperately sought. There are passages from Columbus's own writings where he expresses disappointment at the lack of gold, yet also determination to press onward. It's striking, when you read through the accounts of the time, how the very sea that had promised salvation also carried whispers of isolation and despair. Storms battered the ships, scurvy and hunger gnawed at the crew's strength, and the weight of the unknown pressed down like the thick tropical air. Mutiny hovered on the edges of consciousness, a reminder of human frailty beneath the veneer of adventure. Despite this, Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, his ships laden not only with tales but also with captured natives, parrots, and a handful of gold trinkets. The news of his voyage electrified the Spanish court and the wider European world. He was hailed as a hero, a man who had opened the gates to an unimaginable new world. Yet behind the fanfare, the deeper consequences of this discovery began to take shape, unseen but inexorable. I sometimes wonder about the weight carried by those early voyagers, how they must have wrestled with moments of awe and dread, sailing into waters no map fully charted, depending on stars and instincts, and on fragile human trust. There was courage, certainly, but also a reckless impatience born of desire. Columbus's own writings reveal this tension. He was a man convinced of his destiny, yet navigating shadows as much as light. What followed Columbus's return was a transformation as rapid as it was profound. Spain, now keenly aware of the vast potential of these new lands, prepared for a second voyage. But this time, the spirit of exploration was married to the iron fist of colonization. When Columbus set sail again in 1493, with a fleet of 17 ships and more than 1,000 men, it marked the shift from tentative contact to outright conquest. The soldiers, settlers, and priests who accompanied him brought not just tools and weapons, but a will to impose European order and faith on the islands and their peoples. Forts were built and towns planted, many bearing the names of saints and monarchs. The fragile harmony of the first encounters was broken, replaced by a system that enslaved and exploited. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the right to extract labor from the indigenous population, became the foundation of colonial rule. This period was marked by a tragic unraveling. The Tyino, once numerous and vibrant, faced diseases like smallpox and influenza, plagues for which they had no immunity. Historians estimate that within just a few decades, the population on some islands fell by as much as 90%. Starvation and forced labor compounded the devastation, leading to a near collapse of entire societies. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar who arrived in Hispaniola in the early 16th century, would later bear witness to this human cost. In his writings, he described the cruelty inflicted on the native peoples, lamenting the loss of life and the destruction of cultures. His accounts offer a rare voice of conscience from the time, a gentle but firm reminder that history is not only made by conquerors, but also by those who question their actions. It's a deeply unsettling chapter, how the discovery of America became a story of loss and resilience. One wonders about the voices we never hear, the stories swallowed by time beneath the waves, and the dust of forgotten villages. The narrative Columbus helped begin was far from a simple tale of triumph. It was complex, fraught with contradictions, and ultimately transformative for all involved. The legacy of these first years lingers still, woven into the fabric of the Americas and the world. The blending of cultures, languages, and peoples born of this encounter would shape centuries of history, often marked by conflict, but also by remarkable survival and adaptation. I find myself thinking about how history is remembered, not just in books, but in the quiet moments when we reflect on the past's echoes in our present lives. The story of Columbus's voyage is not only about a man or a date on a calendar. It is about the unfolding of human curiosity, ambition, and consequence. It reminds us that discovery can bring both wonder and sorrow, and that the true story is always richer and more nuanced than the myths we inherit. If we listen closely, beyond the roar of empires and the clatter of conquest, there is a quieter tale, of lives changed forever, of a world reshaped in ways both physical and unseen. The journey that began with those 3 small ships crossing the Atlantic was just the beginning of a vast and ongoing story, one that invites us to look deeper and ask what it truly means to discover a place and to meet another people for the very first time. The first meeting between Christopher Columbus and the people of the Caribbean was a moment that held the promise of curiosity and mutual wonder. On that morning in October 1492, when the sails of the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria finally caught sight of land, it was not just a new world for the Europeans, but a profoundly new encounter between 2 very different ways of life. The island they landed on was one of the Bahamian islands, likely Guanahani, which Columbus renamed San Salvador. The people they met were the Tyino, an Arawakan-speaking indigenous group who had lived in these islands for centuries, their society flourishing in ways Europeans had never imagined. The Tyino were skilled fishermen, farmers, and artisans, their villages peaceful and organized. Columbus in his journal described them as gentle and generous, noting their hospitality with a certain fascination. He wrote about their willingness to trade, their lack of iron or weapons, and their curious yet trusting demeanor. These initial encounters were marked by a delicate dance of misunderstanding and fascination, like 2 strangers trying to glimpse each other through a fog of language and culture. Yet beneath this fragile harmony, there was an undercurrent of unease and silent calculation. Columbus and his crew were not merely travelers hoping for friendship. They were emissaries of a kingdom with designs on wealth and expansion. Columbus saw the native peoples not just as neighbors, but as potential subjects and sources of riches. In his writings, he often mentioned the possibility of converting them to Christianity, seeing them as souls to be saved, but he was equally driven by the promise of gold and other resources. His journal reveals his frustration at the lack of visible gold, but also a growing resolve to claim these lands for Spain, to plant the royal standard and take possession in the name of Ferdinand and Isabella. The Tyino, for their part, approached the newcomers with a mix of curiosity and caution. Their world had known its own stories of voyages and exchanges, but nothing quite like these pale-skinned men with their strange ships and unfamiliar customs. They showed Columbus and his men food, gifts, and warmth, hoping perhaps for peaceful relations. Their eyes likely held questions and wonder, but they could not have guessed the profound changes that these encounters would soon bring. Columbus's journal entries also reveal moments of tension and conflict. While initial contact was mostly peaceful, the European crew's search for gold and their impatience to impose control began to strain relations. Columbus ordered some of the natives to be captured and taken back to Spain as proof of their discovery and to teach the Spanish language. This act was one of the first signs of the darker tides ahead, where curiosity would give way to conquest and hospitality to subjugation. The landing spot quickly became a base of operations for further exploration. Columbus sent smaller parties to nearby islands, including Cuba and Hispaniola, eager to map the territory and find evidence of wealth. These explorations were not just geographical, but deeply personal for Columbus. Every new island was a potential treasure trove. Every meeting with another native community, a chance to assert dominance or gain valuable information. The men he brought with him were caught between awe of the unknown and the practical demands of survival and conquest. There is a haunting passage in Columbus's diary where he notes the innocence of the Tyino and their vulnerability, remarking how easily they could be subdued. This cold pragmatism contrasts starkly with the initial wonder of discovery, revealing the tension between the romantic ideal of exploration and the harsh realities of empire building. It is a reminder that history is often written in the language of power, where the dreams of a few can overshadow the lives of many. The Tyino society itself was complex and rich in tradition. They had intricate social structures, religious beliefs centered on nature and ancestral spirits, and an economy based on farming crops like cassava and sweet potatoes, fishing and trade. Their art, music, and oral histories spoke of a deep connection to the land and sea. When Columbus arrived, he entered a world that was vibrant and alive, yet, tragically, on the brink of dramatic upheaval. Columbus's journals, while invaluable as historical documents, must be read with a critical eye. They reflect his perspective and ambitions more than an objective truth. Later accounts from the native point of view are sadly scarce, as much of their history was oral and disrupted by the cataclysmic events that followed. However, modern scholars and indigenous voices remind us to see these early moments not just as discovery, but as the beginning of a collision that reshaped lives and landscapes forever. The islands became staging grounds for further voyages, and the Spanish soon began to establish footholds. La Navidad, a small fort built from the remains of the Santa Maria, was left behind as a garrison while Columbus returned to Spain for supplies. This outpost would become the first European settlement in the Americas, but its fate was grim. When Columbus returned on his second voyage in 1493, he found La Navidad destroyed, with its inhabitants killed or fled. This episode foreshadowed the violent and turbulent relations that would soon dominate the islands. Columbus's search for gold intensified, and with it, the demands placed on the native populations. The promise of riches drove expeditions inland and across the seas, but the reality was often harsh and unforgiving. The Spanish imposed tribute systems, forced labor, and took hostages to ensure compliance. The gentle hospitality of those first days gave way to fear and resistance. Yet, even amid conflict, moments of exchange and human connection persisted, as stories of friendship, shared knowledge, and cultural curiosity surfaced in rare accounts. Reflecting on these moments, one cannot help but feel the bittersweet weight of history. The encounter between Columbus and the Tyino was a meeting of worlds, filled with hope, misunderstanding, and tragedy. It reminds us that history is not merely about dates and facts, but about people, about the fragile threads that bind us across time and culture. There is a quiet lesson here, in the way curiosity can open doors but also unsettle worlds. Listening closely to the voices from both sides, even when history seems to have drowned some out, offers us a chance to understand the past with more empathy and depth. It invites us to hold the wonder of discovery alongside the pain of loss, and to carry both gently, like whispers in the night, as we continue to explore the stories that shape us. Columbus's first voyage had ended with the foundation of a small settlement, La Navidad, on the northern coast of Hispaniola, built from the remains of the Santa Maria. But it was clear to him, and to those who watched his journey from Spain, that the real prize was still out there, shimmering like a mirage on the horizon. Gold. The glitter of riches pulled at Columbus with an almost desperate intensity, shaping every decision and clouding every hope. He was convinced, with a stubborn certainty, that he had stumbled upon the very edge of Asia, a place where the legendary wealth of the Indies flowed in abundance. Yet what he saw and heard on those islands did not match the glittering treasures he had imagined. The Tyino people who greeted him, with their gentle hospitality and simple tools, did not possess the vast riches of gold and spices he sought. Instead, they lived in harmony with the land, harvesting cassava, fishing in clear waters, and weaving cotton cloth. Still, Columbus could not ignore the promise of wealth, no matter how elusive it seemed. When he set out on his second voyage in 1493, this obsession had taken firm hold of his mind. This time, he commanded a fleet of 17 ships, laden not only with supplies but with soldiers, settlers, priests, and craftsmen. This was no longer just an exploration. It was the beginning of a quest to claim, conquer, and extract. His expedition sailed southward, navigating the turquoise sea toward Cuba, which he initially believed to be part of the Asian mainland. The lush forests, the towering mountains, the strange animals, all fascinated him, but gold remained his single-minded focus. He explored the coastline, probing inland rivers, and communicating as best he could with the native peoples, often through gestures or the few words of a broken Tyino dialect learned by his men. What Columbus found was a landscape rich in natural resources, but gold was scarce. The few small pieces of native gold he acquired, gifts from wary chiefs, were enough to spark greed, but not enough to satisfy. He reported back to the Spanish monarchs with exaggerated hopes, emphasizing the potential rather than the reality. In his letters, he described fertile lands and docile natives who could be converted to Christianity and made to work the soil or mine gold. He wrote, "I have found many islands filled with people who desire to serve your highnesses." But this narrative was only part truth, part hope, and part calculation. He founded a settlement near present-day Cap Haitier called La Navidad, intended as a foothold for Spain in this new world. There he left behind about 40 men to maintain the fort and begin the colony. This decision, though made with optimism, would prove disastrous. Reports later revealed that the men left behind struggled to maintain order and discipline. Conflicts with the Tyino erupted, leading to violence and eventual destruction of La Navidad. Meanwhile, Columbus captured several natives during his explorations, bringing them back to Spain as curiosities and messengers. Among them was a young man named Glocanagari, a chief of one of the Tyino tribes who had shown kindness to Columbus and his men. These captives were meant to serve as intermediaries in future expeditions, bridging the vast cultural divide. Yet, even this goodwill was fragile, built on misunderstandings and a fundamental imbalance of power. Columbus's letters to the Spanish court began to pulse with an urgency that reflected his growing obsession. Gold, he insisted, was just beneath the surface. He described rivers glittering with gold dust, mountains ripe for mining, and people ready to be converted and harnessed for labor. These descriptions were likely a blend of hopeful exaggeration and wishful thinking, fueled by his own hopes and the expectations of the monarchs. The obsession with gold, however, blinded many to the consequences that would ripple through the islands. Columbus and his men began to implement systems of forced labor, demanding tribute from the native populations in the form of gold or cotton. Those who failed to meet these demands faced harsh punishments. The delicate relationship of initial curiosity and hospitality shifted quickly toward exploitation and violence. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this phase was how the Tyino, who had once greeted Columbus with open hands and smiles, became trapped in a cycle of resistance, retaliation, and despair. The Europeans brought with them not only greed but disease, which silently and ruthlessly devastated the native populations. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through the islands, diseases to which the indigenous people had no immunity. It is estimated that within decades, the Tyino population plummeted from hundreds of thousands to mere thousands. As this gold fever spread, the true nature of Columbus's voyage emerged, not just a tale of discovery, but a story of conquest and colonization. The founding of La Navidad was followed by the establishment of new settlements, including La Isabela on the northern coast of Hispaniola, the first permanent European town in the Americas, begun in 1594. Columbus's efforts to extract wealth intensified. Native leaders were forced to collect and deliver quotas of gold, and the encomienda system began to take root. This was a form of labor grant, where colonists were given control over indigenous communities, with the right to extract labor and tribute. While framed as a system of protection and Christianization, in practice, it was often brutal exploitation. The chronicler Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who arrived later in the century, would write passionately about these abuses. He described the suffering of the natives in vivid detail, his words a haunting testament to the costs of Columbus's quest. They burned villages, seized men, women and children, and sold them as slaves, he lamented, revealing the darker legacy of the gold fever. Columbus himself faced criticism and controversy over his harsh methods. Even among the Spanish crown, reports of tyranny and mismanagement reached the monarchs. leading to his eventual arrest and removal from office in 1500. Yet his obsession with finding gold, and the vast wealth that seemed just beyond reach, continued to define the European approach to the New World for centuries to come. Reflecting on this time, I often wonder about the fragile balance between hope and greed, how the promise of wealth can so quickly eclipse empathy and reason. Columbus arrived as a man driven by dreams of glory and riches, but the reality he encountered was complex, human, and, ultimately, tragic. The shining gold he sought was not simply metal. It was the symbol of power and control, and in chasing it, so much was lost. The islands, with their gentle waves and swaying palms, hid beneath their beauty a story of collision between worlds. The initial wonder gave way to conflict, and the golden promise turned into a shadow that stretched across the centuries. In the quiet of the night, as we listen to these stories, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what unfolded. Not just the voyages and battles, but the profound changes etched into the land and its people. It reminds us that history is never just dates and names. It is the unfolding of human dreams, fears, and consequences, all mingled together beneath the endless sky. As the sun set over the Caribbean, the search for gold became more than a quest. It was a turning point that shaped the destiny of continents and peoples. The ripples of those early days of exploration still echo in the present, in how we understand the past and ourselves. And so, the journey continued, driven by a hunger that no amount of discovery could ever fully satisfy. Columbus's return to Spain was a moment steeped in both triumph and the faintest shadow of uncertainty. The year was 1493, and word of his voyage had already begun to spread, carrying with it tales of strange new lands, exotic peoples, and riches that glittered like promises whispered on the wind. When Columbus and his surviving crew finally docked, it was as if the world had shifted on its axis, if only slightly. The Spanish court received him like a conquering hero, but beneath the celebrations, a much larger story was quietly unfolding. The loss of the Santa Maria, the flagship that had run aground on Christmas Day of 1492, was a sober reminder of how perilous the journey had been. Yet, in the hands of the crown, Columbus's narrative was shaped into one of undeniable success. Spain was hungry for glory, for expansion, and for wealth, and Columbus offered a tantalizing glimpse into a vast new horizon. His tales of native peoples, of fertile lands, and of potential riches sparked imaginations and kindled ambitions. The young Queen Isabella, known for her devout faith and shrewd mind, saw in Columbus a tool for expanding Christendom, but also a means to enhance Spain's prestige in the fierce rivalry with Portugal. It was not only the royal family who listened. The Pope, Alexander VI, granted a papal bull endorsing Spain's claim to the newly found territories. This document, known as Inter Caetura, drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic, dividing lands between Spain and Portugal, a decree that would lay the groundwork for centuries of colonial competition, but also for conflict and exploitation. The Church, eager to spread its influence, saw the discovery as a divine mission, a chance to convert souls and extend the reach of Christianity. And yet, the complexity of what Columbus had stumbled upon was far from the simplistic narrative that would later be taught in classrooms. Columbus returned not just with gold dust and reports, but with people, native captives taken from the islands, brought to Spain as living proof of his journey. These indigenous individuals, bewildered and displaced, were paraded in court and exhibited to curious crowds, a haunting symbol of what was to come. Their presence sparked both fascination and unease among Europeans, who struggled to comprehend these new faces and their unfamiliar customs. It was a moment of raw encounter between worlds, one that foreshadowed the profound and often tragic transformations to follow. While the monarchs celebrated, Spain was already planning the next steps. Columbus's success had given the crown a new sense of direction, but it also came with expectations. Expectations of wealth, of territory, and of dominance. Soon, preparations began for a second voyage, one much larger and more heavily armed, signaling a shift from exploration to colonization. the fragile peace of first contact would give way to ambitions far more brutal and complex. One detail that often escapes notice is how carefully Columbus crafted his own image upon return. His letters and reports to the monarchs were filled with optimism and promises of vast riches, particularly gold. However, many scholars today note how these claims often outpaced reality. For instance, Columbus's assumption that the islands he explored were the outskirts of Asia created a persistent misconception that shaped European understanding of the Americas for decades. His reports sometimes exaggerated native populations and potential wealth to ensure continued support, a reminder that history is often a delicate interplay of truth and persuasion. Among those who witnessed Columbus's return was the historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, who later documented many of these early encounters. He wrote about the awe and curiosity that filled the Spanish court, but also about the uncertainties beneath the surface, how the land was not the Asia they sought, but something else entirely, a world new and unknown. It was as if we had stepped into a dream, Oviedo reflected, capturing the mixture of wonder and apprehension that coloured this moment. The arrival of Columbus's expedition also sparked a wave of stories and rumours that spread quickly through Europe. Exotic accounts of gold-laden islands and friendly natives filled taverns and noble halls alike, fueling both hope and greed. The New World became a symbol of possibility, a blank page upon which European ambitions could be written. Yet, the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The islands Columbus visited, Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola, were diverse and rich with life, home to complex indigenous societies whose ways of life would soon be irrevocably altered. One cannot overlook the tragic irony embedded in this chapter of history. Columbus's return was celebrated as a monumental victory, yet the seeds of suffering and upheaval had already been planted. The establishment of La Navidad, the fort Columbus left behind on Hispaniola, was meant to secure Spain's foothold, but it quickly became a symbol of conflict and misunderstanding. The settlers left there faced hostility and hardship, struggling to survive in an environment that was new and unforgiving, while relations with indigenous peoples began to sour under the weight of exploitation and violence. It is tempting to view Columbus's return as a neat turning point, a moment when the course of history was set in stone. But the truth is messier. This was a moment of beginnings, of stories that would intertwine in unexpected ways, of dreams that would clash with harsh realities, and of a world on the brink of transformation. The hero's welcome Columbus received was only the first page of a much larger, far more complex story. I find it interesting to consider how this story might have sounded to those early listeners. The tension between hope and fear, the pull of adventure balanced against the unknown costs. There was a deep human element here, the desire to explore, to expand horizons, but also the instinct to control, to claim, to conquer. It's a duality that resonates across centuries, reminding us that history is not just about dates and facts, but about the people who lived through these moments, with all their hopes and contradictions. Reflecting on the historical records, I'm reminded of a quote from Bartolomé de las Casas, a later chronicler and advocate for indigenous rights. He described these early encounters as the beginning of a great sorrow, a phrase that captures the bittersweet legacy of Columbus's return. It's a sober reminder that discovery, in this context, was never just about finding new lands. It was also about what those lands and their peoples would endure. As the court in Spain celebrated, the wheels of empire were quietly turning. The papal bull, the royal endorsements, the public acclaim, they were all threads weaving together the fabric of a vast colonial project. What Columbus brought back was more than gold or captives. It was a key that unlocked a door to a new world, one that would soon be shaped by forces of power, faith, and ambition on a scale no one had yet imagined. Looking back on this moment, I can't help but feel a mix of fascination and melancholy. It was the dawn of a new era, full of promise, but shadowed by the profound changes it would bring. And through it all, the story of Columbus remains a mirror reflecting our own complexities, our thirst for discovery, our flaws, and the enduring impact of those first steps into unknown waters. The fleet that sailed from Spain in 1493 was unlike anything the world had seen before. 17 ships, carrying over 1,000 men, including soldiers, priests, farmers, and craftsmen, set out not merely to explore, but to establish a foothold. This was no longer a voyage of uncertain adventure, but the beginning of a deliberate, forceful colonization. The atmosphere was charged with both hope and tension. Hope for wealth, glory, and new beginnings, but tension from the unknown challenges awaiting them on the islands they would try to claim. When Columbus returned to the Caribbean, the islands had changed since his first brief encounter. The temporary outpost of La Navidad, which he had left on Hispaniola, was destroyed. The reasons remained partly mysterious, but involved conflicts with indigenous groups, and likely internal disputes among the settlers themselves. This early failure underscored the difficulties ahead. Establishing a permanent colony meant facing a hostile environment, unfamiliar diseases, and increasingly strained relations with the native Tyino people. The soldiers and settlers who arrived with Columbus were not just adventurers, but agents of a new empire. They came with the explicit mission of subjugating the islands, securing resources, and spreading Christianity. The friars who accompanied the fleet believed in the spiritual imperative to convert the indigenous populations, often without regard for their existing beliefs or customs. This mission, wrapped in the language of salvation, soon took on a darker hue as the practical realities of conquest and exploitation unfolded. The Spanish quickly constructed forts and small towns to consolidate their control, including a settlement that would become Santo Domingo, now the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the Americas. These fortifications were both symbols of imperial power and practical defenses against possible resistance. Indigenous resistance was not long in coming. The Tyino, whose initial curiosity had given way to suspicion and fear, mounted several uprisings. Though largely outgunned and overwhelmed by the better armed Europeans, their resistance revealed an enduring will to defend their homeland. One of the most haunting aspects of this period was the institution of forced labor, the encomienda system. Essentially, Spanish settlers were granted rights to the labor and tribute of indigenous communities, often under brutal conditions. While cloaked in the language of protection and Christianization, encomienda became a system of exploitation. The Tyino were forced to mine gold, work plantations, and sustain the colonial settlements. Over time, the population, already devastated by diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, unseen and lethal enemies brought by the Europeans, collapsed dramatically. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish friar who arrived during the second voyage, later chronicled these tragedies in powerful and sorrowful accounts. His writings revealed the brutal realities: villages emptied, cultures dismantled, and lives extinguished in numbers that defy easy comprehension. He described how entire communities were wiped out, not by warfare alone, but by starvation, disease, and relentless overwork. His voice, both anguished and prophetic, became one of the earliest critiques of colonial abuses, though his pleas often fell on deaf ears. The second voyage was a turning point, marking the transformation of the Caribbean from a place of tentative exploration into a colonial empire's frontier. Columbus himself became a figure of growing authority, appointed governor of the new territories. But with power came controversy. Reports of his harsh governance, including accusations of tyranny and cruelty, reached the Spanish crown. There were complaints from settlers and natives alike, and the Spanish court eventually sent royal officials to investigate. Columbus's ambitions and the brutal methods used to maintain control were tangled in a web of greed, faith, and imperial ambition. One personal reflection that often crosses my mind when I consider these early years of colonization is the sheer complexity of the human experience within them. These were people caught between worlds: Spanish settlers dreaming of gold and glory, indigenous peoples defending their homes and cultures, missionaries believing they were saving souls, and explorers facing the vast unknown. The story is not just one of conquest but of tragedy and collision, of hope and despair intertwined. The arrival of the Second Fleet also heralded the beginnings of a new social order in the Americas. European plants, animals, and customs began to transform the landscape and the lives of its inhabitants. Horses, introduced for the first time, changed indigenous warfare and mobility. while crops like wheat and sugar reshaped agriculture. At the same time, the demand for labor escalated, and the tragic cycle of forced indigenous labor eventually gave rise to the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were brought to the Caribbean to replace the dwindling native workforce, marking the beginning of centuries of brutal slavery that would shape the continent's history. While the Spanish were consolidating their hold, native resistance continued in different forms. Some indigenous groups chose accommodation and negotiation. Others fled into remote regions, and still others fought fiercely in a struggle that would persist for generations. The early colonial period was not a simple story of European domination, but a complex and ongoing contest with many voices and faiths entwined. It is striking to consider the immense transformations this second voyage set in motion in such a short span of time. What began as a journey of exploration had become a campaign of empire building, with profound consequences. The islands that Columbus and his men landed upon were never the same again. In the centuries that followed, the Caribbean would become a crucible for cultural blending, conflict, and resistance. Its history forever marked by those early years of arrival, conquest, and upheaval. Hearing the accounts of the men and women who lived through this era, I am reminded of the fragile nature of history itself, how it is shaped by perspective, power, and memory. We often focus on the figures of Columbus in the Spanish crown, but the lives of the indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans reveal the other side of this story. Their resilience and suffering echo through time, challenging us to remember the full human cost behind the dates and deeds. The weight of these events invites reflection on how we understand the discovery of America. It was not a simple encounter, but a moment that unleashed profound change, politically, culturally, and ecologically. It prompts us to listen carefully to all voices, including those too often silenced, and to grasp the tangled legacies that continue to shape the Americas today. As I think back on this period, I feel a deep sense of the unknown beneath the surface of recorded history. The stories yet untold, the lives lost or transformed, and the shadows of hope and sorrow mingling in the dawn of a new world. This second voyage was just the beginning of a long, complex journey, whose echoes we still live with in so many ways. If we pause here, in the quiet aftermath of this moment, we begin to see not just the outlines of conquest, but the human stories beneath, of ambition and resistance, of dreams and devastation, all woven into the fabric of what would become a new chapter in human history. The arrival of Europeans in the Caribbean was not just a moment of contact between distant peoples. It quickly became a tragic turning point, an abrupt rupture in the lives of the native Tyino and other indigenous peoples. What followed in the decades after Columbus's second voyage in 1493 was a profound and devastating reshaping of the New World, one marked by disease, forced labor, and a brutal system of exploitation that would echo through centuries. Smallpox, influenza, measles, these invisible invaders were the first and deadliest weapons Europeans unknowingly brought across the ocean. The Tyino, like many indigenous groups, had no prior exposure or immunity to these diseases, which spread swiftly and mercilessly. Historians estimate that within just a few decades, up to 90% of the Tyino population perished. One can almost imagine the eerie silence that must have settled over the once vibrant villages, where the laughter of children and the rhythms of daily life faded into ghosts. This catastrophic loss was not a direct act of war, but the tragic consequence of biological invasion, a silent epidemic that swept through entire communities before many Europeans even fully grasped its scale. But disease was only the beginning. The newcomers, driven by their own ambitions and visions of empire, imposed a harsh new order. The encomienda system, established in the early 1500s, became the foundation of colonial rule. It was, in essence, a grant from the Spanish crown, allowing colonists to claim groups of indigenous people as laborers. In theory, encomenderos were to protect and Christianize their assigned natives, but in practice, it often meant forced labor, brutal working conditions, and little regard for life or dignity. Many Tyino found themselves pressed into mining gold or cultivating cash crops under the harshest conditions, their lives reduced to mere survival. The word encomienda may sound distant and bureaucratic, but it represented a system of exploitation that tore apart families and communities, leaving scars visible in the historical record and in the collective memory of the region. One voice from that time rises above the pages of dusty archives. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who became one of the earliest and most vocal advocates for indigenous rights. Having witnessed the abuses firsthand, he wrote passionately about the suffering inflicted upon the native peoples. In his 1552 work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, he detailed the cruelty, forced labor, and massive death toll. Las Casas' testimony is haunting, not only for the horror it reveals, but for its urgent call for justice. He lamented that entire civilizations had been destroyed, almost overnight, and pleaded for humane treatment and reform. His writings remain some of the earliest recorded critiques of colonial brutality, a reminder that even in those early days, not everyone was silent or complicit. It is important, though, to remember the human faces behind these broad historical forces. The Tyino were not just passive victims. There were acts of resistance, quiet defiance, and efforts to preserve culture amid unimaginable upheaval. Stories passed down through generations speak of leaders and communities striving to protect their people, their lands, and their identities, even as the ground shifted beneath their feet. The struggles of the Tyino, the Caribs, and other indigenous peoples in the Caribbean are chapters of resilience as much as tragedy. As the years passed, the initial wave of conquest and colonization set patterns repeated throughout the Americas. The exploitation of indigenous peoples expanded, and with it, the establishment of a transatlantic system that would shape global history. The Columbian Exchange. This was not just a transfer of goods or crops. It was an exchange that forever altered ecosystems, economies, and cultures on both sides of the ocean. Europeans introduced horses, cattle, and wheat, while the Americas offered maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco, foods that would transform diets worldwide. But beneath this exchange lay the painful cost of human lives and suffering, often overshadowed by narratives of progress and discovery. Reflecting on this, I often find myself caught between admiration for the resilience of the native peoples and the sobering reality of what was lost. It challenges the way we think about discovery, colonization, and history itself. These are not simple stories of heroism or tragedy, but complex, interwoven tales of encounter, conflict, and transformation. The legacy of 1492 is tangled in these paradoxes, a moment that opened the door to a new world, but one that came at an unimaginable human price. The long shadow of these early years is still visible today, in the cultures, languages, and struggles of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Their stories continue, even as we grapple with how to remember and teach this history. It is a history that calls for empathy and honesty, for listening to voices that have often been silenced or forgotten. And so, as the waves of history continue to roll forward, we carry with us the echoes of those first encounters, the hope and horror, the dreams and devastation. It is a reminder that history is never just the past. It lives in the present, in the stories we tell and the truths we choose to face. The story of Columbus lingers in history like a shadow, stretching far beyond the moment when his ships first touched the shores of what Europeans came to call the New World. To many, he remains a heroic figure, a symbol of daring and discovery, a man who dared to sail into the unknown and reshaped the course of human history. Yet, as we settle deeper into the quiet reflections of this momentous past, it becomes clear that his legacy is not so simple. It is a tapestry woven with triumph and tragedy, with courage and cruelty, with glory and loss. In the years that followed Columbus's voyages, the world would never be the same. The exchanges between continents, people, plants, animals, ideas, would alter civilizations forever. We call this the Columbian Exchange, a term coined by historian Alfred Crosby in the 1970s. It describes the vast movement of species and cultures between the Old World and the Americas after 1492. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes made their way to Europe, while horses, cattle, and wheat crossed the ocean to the Americas. These exchanges transformed diets, economies, and environments on a global scale. But they also introduced devastating diseases to indigenous populations. smallpox, measles, influenza, against which native peoples had no immunity. The consequences of these diseases were catastrophic. Some scholars estimate that by the mid-16th century, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Caribbean and parts of mainland America had perished. It was a silent, invisible force, more lethal than any sword or cannon. The Tyino people, among the first to meet Columbus, faced near extinction within decades. Survivors endured forced labor, displacement, and cultural erasure under the encomienda system, a brutal colonial policy that effectively enslaved indigenous peoples to work mines and plantations for Spanish settlers. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar and one of the earliest advocates for indigenous rights, documented these horrors with a heavy heart. In his brief account of the destruction of the Indies, he wrote in 1542 about the grievous and cruel injury inflicted upon the native peoples, describing scenes of unspeakable misery and destruction. His accounts helped to expose the darker side of conquest, shining a light on the suffering that often lay hidden behind the narratives of exploration and empire. But beyond the tragedies, the impact of 1492 resonates in complex ways. Columbus's voyages opened the doors to an interconnected world, laying the groundwork for globalization centuries before the word existed. The New World became a meeting place of continents, where European, African, and Native American histories intertwined in ways that would shape culture, politics, and identity up to the present day. This complex legacy is still fiercely debated today. Columbus Day, celebrated in many parts of the Americas as a symbol of national heritage and exploration, has become a point of contention. For many indigenous communities, it represents the beginning of colonization, displacement, and cultural genocide. Cities like Los Angeles and Denver have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, honoring the resilience and cultures of native peoples, rather than the man who brought their world to ruin. Statues of Columbus, once erected as proud monuments, have become lightning rods for protest and reflection. The very symbols meant to honor history have been re-examined with a new understanding, revealing the uncomfortable truths of conquest and its consequences. The question is no longer simply who Columbus was, but what he represents to us today. What stories do we choose to remember, and which do we leave in silence? Listening to voices from indigenous scholars, activists, and communities, one hears a call not just for remembrance, but for justice and reconciliation. They urge us to look beyond myths and myths makers, to confront the pain and resilience that followed 1492, and to celebrate the rich, living cultures that survived against all odds. Their perspectives invite us to rewrite history with empathy, honoring those who lived through colonization and those who still carry its legacy. It is worth pausing to reflect on how history is told. The story of the discovery of America, once presented as a simple triumph of navigation and bravery, reveals itself to be a story of encounters, some peaceful, some violent, of curiosity mixed with exploitation, of immense human suffering alongside incredible endurance. Understanding this complexity helps us grasp not only the past but the present, as the legacies of 1492 ripple through our societies in ways both visible and unseen. In quiet moments, when we consider the vastness of the oceans crossed and the worlds forever altered, there is a bittersweet beauty in this history. The ships that set sail from Spain on that autumn day in 1492 carried hopes and fears, dreams and dangers, all woven into a single journey. They ushered in an era that would shape the world in profound and often painful ways, reminding us how closely wonder and loss often travel together. As we end this exploration, I find myself thinking about the nature of discovery itself, not as a conquest or claim, but as an opening, a meeting of worlds, and a shared story still unfolding. The land we now call America had been home to millions for millennia, full of vibrant cultures and histories before Columbus ever sailed. His voyages were a turning point, but not a beginning. Thank you for joining me in this late-night journey through one of history's most profound moments. If this story brought you some new thoughts, a moment of quiet wonder, or a deeper understanding, I hope you'll stay curious and come back for the next story waiting in the shadows of time. Until then, take care Rest well, and good night. If you enjoyed this, a gentle like and subscribe means a lot, helping us keep these stories alive, and sharing them with those who might need a calm companion in their day or night. Sweet dreams.